Art as design generator in the architecture studio. I am Madeleine Stoffberg, a senior lecturer at the Namibia University of Science and Technology, teaching in the Master's Design Studio. Most of you know what an architecture design studio is. It's a place where we engage with students and where we actively practice the art of making. Often this process followed is that of the master student apprenticeship approach. Throughout the years, we found that this is not such an effective method. Students are spoon-fed, but also, especially to the later years, students' creative process is hindered and becomes hampered, are not as creative as they should be. So from 2022, we started to think about the architecture studio as a learning lab. And this is a process where we then look at exploratory design, where we engage in artistic approaches, and through that process, students then develop their methodology throughout the year. Now, Robinson considers this not as a method with a goal, an end goal in mind. Rather, it's a resting point with many possible such points along the way. And sometimes students need to discard a point, and that is this exploratory process they follow. In Robinson's exploratory process, they looked at 8 different steps. Examination of preconceptions, gathering of information, looking at the future but also at the past through precedents, looking at codes and standards, using analogy in problem exploration, and then activities of place analysis, and then lastly, looking at context, energy, and technology. Now, this exploratory process is slightly different, where we look at 3 exercises combining various of these steps. And it's not a linear process as described by Robinson, but rather a triad where one constantly moves between this. This then allows us to look at words and images simultaneously. This combines verbal and visual thinking. So it's describing the project in words and then using images, sketches, models to develop those words further throughout the design. According to Schoen, learning is essential to designing, and there is a great potential for learning through design. And it's this interactive, relational idea behind design that is fostered and that students through this approach develop further. So what we investigate is this triad between structure, site and context, and then words. So considering different ways to look at structure. So here structure would be aspects such as precedents, structure, what is done in the past, that would be that reflection on the past, but also what the future could be. And here the students are encouraged specifically to investigate models. And through model building, sketches of that precedent and analysis of those details. Then they also look at site and context, so how that could be understood in plan and 2 dimensions, and then also words, thinking in words, what the title could be, what the words could be. And throughout this process, students then look at different textures, different structures, different ways of making. So what we see here is looking at the structure, then we look at shadow play, and also thinking in words. So those are the 3 methods that's explored. So first, looking at the structure, students identify 3 precedents, Thereafter, they analyze them, identify key areas, build 3 models of these specific spatial, structural, material solutions. They then deduce that into one model that then could be applied to their design. So that is a sectional model. That sectional model is then taken further into what we call shadow play. So here, that same model is then used to cast some shadows, taking that back to what the 2-dimensional spatial implications could be. Parallel to this, they do some exercises, what we call thinking in words, where they think of what is the concept, the sight response, the ideas that they want to implement in this design. And through thinking in words, we also look at sight. So how do they position the structure on sight? So this can't be isolated as a linear process or 1, 2, 3 steps. It's rather a parallel process that we investigate. So thinking in words is this idea of starting with words as a spiral, starting from the center and writing down your thoughts. Why a spiral? So that we don't write linearly. One idea is not necessarily a consequence or following on the previous. It's just this, if I can say, vomiting of words and ideas to get what is in our minds onto paper. These ideas are then translated into these thinking in words exercises where they take their ideas identified in the spiral and relate that to space. In this particular example, the student worked at the edge of Swakopmund, a coastal town in Namibia, and he wanted to look at or re-emphasize the sound of the sea. So here's a play of the signified and the signifier, the sea as the sea also as a space that could reflect sound, that could reflect that noise of the sea, but also provide a backdrop to take away the noise from the town itself. So here you can see the idea of the sea, the community gathering sound, and spatially what the sea could be. So the sea becomes much more just as the signified and the signifier. It's that interrelationship between the two and the spatial relationship. Another student investigated linkages in the town of Walvis Bay, again at the coast of Swakopmund, and he wanted to connect the sea, the edge, which is the harbor, with the tourist info center and the rest of the town. And through these linkages, this K letter became the link or the possible link, and also a code, the signifier of what this link could be. So this led really to the investigation of what that link could be. What is the connection between the structure of a sail and the mast of a sailboat? So that really became that code for him to explore it further. This could also then be seen as sections, so looking at water in Stampriet and thinking what is below surface and what is above, and how that A could become the extraction of the water from below to the above, and how the T then also connects that idea. So using text to think of concept and what is the spatial implications. This is developed further in structure. So students investigated several models. It's not one model, several models, starting with structure and conceptual, as in some cases you can see here in the case of student C, where they then build several reiterations of what that structure could be. So here you can see again student C looking at K, the mast, with the sail and how that connects to the ground, connects to context, and the relationship of these different masts to each other. This is then taken into shadow play. So here each model placed in a certain position against a page, and students then investigate shadows cast to further explore 2-dimensional spaces. Here you can see the exercise in shadow play, again student C, and what spaces are created in section but also on plan. And this could then be applied on plan. This is a good example of where you can see the student adding their model to then the page, investigating the shadows. And this allowed the students to not only just cast one shadow, but to consider the overlap of various shadows on paper, and then also that relationship to context. So here we can see in context what that would mean. Students also produced more abstract reiterations or interpretations of their shadows. And this allowed students to consider the human scale in space, the relationship of the earth to the sky, and structure in their design approach. Further to the above, one can also see how section can be translated back to plan. So this is a model of a section which the student then cast shadows of on paper, then again considering that same idea on plan. Here we can see how that initial idea of thinking in words, the C, translate to the model. In context, you can see there is the Swakopmund Aquarium and the building that the student then saw as a performance for the sea. So the sea is performing, the sound of the sea, but also how that sea could become a performance space for human. And the sea turning its back, the sea as a letter, on the small town of Swakopmund to then reduce noise and heighten this sound of the sea, that experience. Various reiterations, drawings, help the students then develop these ideas. So how do we integrate this with AI? And here we think of AI as a tool. So after all these artistic explorations, students were tasked to prompt AI by adding the image, CV content, and then their prompts. And some students found it beneficial and others unfortunately not as beneficial. So I would like to just highlight 2 projects of students and their 3 prompts. Here we can again see that consideration of what happens below. And this is difficult to consider in section when just drawing by hand. And here we can see 2 different ideas. What happens below, that idea of light, human scale, and then that of function. How the water from below could become a system providing for livelihoods. Student F used this original piece that she made by hand herself, really looking at unearthing of precious stones in the Brandberg area in Namibia, and how that could then become a space for these local miners to have an income, but also share knowledge of this practice of unearthing these stones. And here we see a good representation. So it helped her to identify the internal relationship, light qualities, what these spaces could be programmatically. Also considering in section how the idea of the Welwitscher, which she then learned from in that context, could be incorporated into the section. One could, however, critique that this root system is dissociated from the space that is considered or developed. And there's not a lot of contextual relationship. So here one can ask, how do you enter the building? So those are things that still needs to be investigated through AI so that those limitations could be explored. To summarize, we can refer back to this idea of this triad, this triangular process of the structure, thinking in words, and then shadow play, and how one moves between this. And this is not a one-step approach or something that is cast in stone. Rather, students can start at a different point, move back to a certain step, and reiteratively develop these ideas. So thinking in words, taking these concepts, developing titles, which is often necessary for master study, how that influence your choice of structure, your contextual response, how we learn from the structure to develop our plan, the space, the program, going back to our ideas. What could the structure be? How do spaces, function, relate to context? So moving back to and fro in this triad between them. And here we can see student C, just to reflect on it, the initial structure that he thought of, inspired by the link, that link between the mast, the sail, but also the code and the meaning of that K, and then thinking in shadows and taking that back to plan and moving between those 3 steps. So in the Master Studio, we can see taking these steps is not the end goal. Here you can see a student going through the whole process. It is a stepping stone towards design reiteration. It is ideas that could be developed by hand. So it's the thinking hand, linking the hand with the mind, linking the hand with a context, going back to what we touch and how we design, and how each line we make could contribute to that. Moving away slightly from computer-aided drafted drawing so that we test in our lab. Thank you.